All right, so today we're going to be covering natal retrograde planets. We're going to look at what a retrograde means, what it is in a transit, and what it's like to have this natally or when you're born. So, retrograde is when a planet apparently moves backwards in the sky. Of course, it does not literally do that, but the Earth is moving around the sun as well as other planets, and they all have different speeds in which they're moving. So some are going to go faster, some are going to go slower. And as that happens, it looks like they are moving backwards. So it's kind of like when you're in a car and you're stopped and you look over and there's a car next to you and they start moving and you kind of get this weird dizzying feeling because you feel like you're moving. So it has that same kind of sensation where the perspective is what makes it look like it's retrograde. You can see on this table on the right all of the planets that go retrograde and how frequently they go retrograde, as well as the number of days. So the sun and moon never will retrograde. It's just Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. It is extremely common for people to be born with Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto retrograde. And Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, it doesn't retrograde as often, but it remains in retrograde for a long time. So you can see Uranus remains in retrograde for 155 days, Neptune for 160, Pluto for 165. So you can see why so many people will have these planets retrograde in their chart, because while they do retrograde less frequently, they stay in that backwards orbit for a really, really long time. When I see this in somebody's natal chart, it's not really that significant to me. It's not that they're not going to notice it at all, but it has a much more collective experience, especially the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. These are things that are going to be retrograde for so many people at one time that it really is this kind of collective experience to have these planets retrograde. So we're not going to talk too much about them because their meaning really doesn't change that much. And as astrologers, it's hard for us to even tell like exactly how this impacts people on a very personal level. The planets that I am super interested in somebody's chart are Venus retrograde, Mars retrograde, Jupiter, and Saturn retrograde. And that's because these will retrograde much less frequently. And they will retrograde for, varied amounts of time, but I do notice that when they do retrograde and when they are captured in someone's natal chart, when they're born in a retrograde cycle, it is a very tangible and noticeable experience in that person's life and in that person's personality. So, for example, Venus will retrograde only every 19 months, and it will retrograde for 42 days. So it's not even every year that Venus is going retrograde. And so when it does retrograde, it feels very strong. It affects a lot of relationships. It creates a lot of confusion and uncertainty about relationships. And so when somebody's born during this period of time, it really does impact their ability to relate with other people. And you can see in this percentage here on the second column, you can see how common it is for people to have these planets retrograde in their chart. Venus and Mars in particular are the ones that when I see it retrograde in a chart, when it has the RX or it's red, I'm immediately drawn to that, immediately trying to figure out what the soul is trying to do in this lifetime, either related to relationships or their own willpower and their masculine and feminine energy. So only 7% of people will have a Venus retrograde. So again, it's the most rare thing to have in a chart, very noticeable. Mars retrograde only happens for every 9% of people, and it only retrogrades every 25 months. So again, this is not even happening every year. The retrograde is about 80 days. That will vary. And so if you happen to being born within those 80 days, the Mars retrograde is going to really impact you, the way that you relate to the masculine, your willpower, your sexuality, on all of the above. Jupiter and Saturn retrograde, while they are more common, between 30 and 35% of people have this, I still tend to notice them as a little bit more predominant in people's lives. Like it's a noticeable effect on the way that they live their life or things that they experience. And we'll get into what that is. Jupiter retrogrades every 13 months for about 4 months, and Saturn retrogrades about every year for 4.5 months. So there's still a pretty wide window in which people can be born during those periods of time. You'll also see in this chart where it has a number of stationary days in the second to last column. So when a planet is stationary, it essentially means that it's slowing down to almost a halt. And this is when it's trying to change direction. So it's either going to move direct or move retrograde. So when you have a planet stationary in your chart, which it's a little bit complicated to kind of find out the speed of a planet, but you can Google things online, like for specifically the day that you were born, what was the speed of Venus? And you can start to see, like, is that really slow for how Venus typically moves, or is that really fast? Like, where is she at in her cycle? Because if a planet is stationary when you are born, it can have also a really strong effect on your life, and sometimes a negative effect, because that planet isn't moving forward. It's halted in the sky. So it can have almost like this inhibitory effect. And I've seen this with people who have, for example, Venus stationary, and it will kind of negatively impact their love life, even when they have other elements of their chart that don't necessarily indicate that. So the speed of a planet can be very important, but you can see with the very small number of days per year that these planets are stationary, that it's not very common to have a stationary planet. So it's not usually something that I'm looking at in people's charts, unless there's, an inexplicable reason why they're having an issue in their life based off of their chart, which is not very common. Okay, so what does a retrograde transit mean? So this is talking about if, you hear your favorite astrologer saying, Mars is retrograde right now, which it actually is, then what does that mean, though, for us and for your chart? Like, let's say it's not in your birth chart, but it's happening to you and to everyone else in lifetime. So when a planet goes retrograde, it's giving us an opportunity to process, think, and assimilate information that we have been learning and things that we have been experiencing while that planet was moving direct. So Mars is a planet of action, of direction, of ambition. When it's moving retrograde, it's asking us to look at the things that we have taken action on and committed to. Do we want to keep committing to those things? Do we want to pare down? Do we want to take action in a different way? It's very, very important that we take these times to reflect about how to do things differently in the future, as well as wrap up old projects that we maybe started and never finished. Because if we don't have these moments of reflection and check-in, we are basically always living on the go. We're always producing, we're always moving ahead, and a lot of things can get missed and be kind of overlooked. And so people don't necessarily always think of retrograde as a positive thing, because it is a feminine, internal, intuitive, an almost spiritual process of integration. And our society doesn't really value integration as much as production. And so you can see people fear retrogrades in many ways, but it is a very important and pivotal part of every cycle. But some of the fear does come around the fact that the planets and their natural significations tend to go a little bit haywire around that period of time. So for example, Mercury's natural significations have to do with communication, transportation, moving information. And so during this time, contracts can get lost or confused. People can miss their planes and their trains. So it can get a little bit crazy. And that's, again, just a time to maybe step back from those elements of your life and reflect, rather than try to start a bunch of new things in the area related to that planet's significations. So what does it mean to have a planet that is retrograde in your natal chart or when you're born? So this, again, will still have this kind of internal expression. And it can also be a little bit different from the rest of your chart. A retrograde planet is kind of like an outcast in a way, or a maverick, or unsocialized. It tends to be operating on its own. It doesn't really look to the rest of your chart for a whole synthesis, because generally each planet of the chart creates this system, like this little family, and the retrograde planet is like the black sheep. And this could also be the case for an unaspected planet that's making no contact with any other part of your chart or any other planet. So a retrograde planet has that kind of maverick, unsocialized quality, which means that it can embody more of its natural signification. So, for example, a Mars planet might be much more Marsy and much more kind of associated with its own topics, its own ideas associated with Mars, without being inhibited or fired up by other elements of the chart. So it tends to kind of do things on its own. And that sometimes means that outside in the real world, there can be a difficulty with more socialization. So, for example, a Mars retrograde person might have trouble actually asserting themselves in an important conversation where they need to stand up for themselves. It's still very much surrounding Mars topics, but it's a deficit of them in some ways, or a difficult relationship with them. Sometimes also the ego can try to protect this planet and not necessarily do what it does with the other planets, which is try to integrate them and have them work together towards a goal. So, for example, Venus retrograde, the ego might allow that person to sit in the idealization of harmony and cooperation that Venus is so known for. So very pure energy of Venus, but in an unrealistic fashion, because it's not tethered down to Earth by Saturn, for example, or other parts of the chart that keep it in reality. So Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in particular can create some of those more noticeable kind of social difficulties out in the world when their lessons haven't always been worked through. This is going to be earlier in life. So the retrograde planet can also have this kind of like child-like naivete where it is having this very insular experience. So it's cut off from the rest of the chart, and it makes it have a more internal journey where its own subjective experience is perceived as reality. And this can be a little bit difficult because there is a true objective collective experience, and then there is the subjective personal internal experience, and those are usually different. And so the retrograde planet almost seems to lack awareness of what that overall bigger picture is, because again, it's not necessarily receiving a lot of information from the other planets, even if it's aspecting it. It's almost like it's not able to fully understand or process what the other planets are trying to teach it. So it's like a rebellious teenager that its parents are trying to get through to him or to her, and they're just not able to see kind of how maybe doing drugs from a young age or, drinking and driving can have these really long-term serious consequences on their life. They're more so seeing what they want to do in the moment, and that is their reality. And so it can have this kind of childlike innocence to it, and purity to it in terms of unadulterated by outside influences. However, there's often a time when this planet is awakened through the outside world, through external circumstances, and it's almost like surprised or taken off guard at how this is not reality, and how there is maybe a need to become more aware of other facets of life to help balance this planet out and to help them see a wider range of what's going on. A really good outlet for a retrograde planet is to have some kind of channel or obsession where it can put its drive and energy into. And this is one of the best ways to utilize it, although that's not always easy to do. So if you can think about the nature of the planet, you can start to see, well, what drive or what desire does this planet have in my chart? And how can I really hone that in and act on it? However, that's usually where there is hesitancy when a planet is retrograde. That's usually where there's a feeling of holding oneself back. And sometimes you can even feel powerless in this area of your life because of that hesitancy, because of that disconnect and uncertainty. And sometimes that can mean that there's almost like this rage or this unexpressed energy that can come out sideways and influence the person's life where they might not even be totally sure of where it's coming from or why it's happening. And usually it's because there's a planet not being fully expressed as a part of ourselves. So if you think about Mars, for example, which is all about anger, retrograde, if somebody doesn't allow themselves to kind of go after what they want in life and experience anger and assert themselves on the world, all Mars topics, it might come out in these really weird sideways ways, which we'll talk about in a second. Mercury retrograde in the natal chart. So Mercury is a kind of like carrier pigeon between the conscious and subconscious mind. It will help us take these images from the subconscious and bring them forth into information that we can share, that we can communicate, that we can actually understand and conceptualize besides just images. And so when you have Mercury retrograde, you actually have an easier time going into the subconscious and accessing information in the way that the subconscious processes things. So the subconscious will process information in a nonverbal, nonlinear, symbolic, imagery-based, and feminine way. So it's very strong intuition. If you think about your dreams where things don't really make much sense, but they're very experiential and they're very visual and felt, that is what the subconscious is doing. It's processing our life in these weird metaphors and symbolism that Mercury then tries to create meaning out of for our conscious mind. And so those with Mercury retrograde will have the greater ability to tap into these parts of themselves so they can have a really beautiful creative mind if they allow it to bubble up from their subconscious, and they could have heightened powers of intuition as well. I have also heard that people with Mercury retrograde may feel like they were not fully heard or listened to as children. And so you guys can go ahead and judge that for yourself if that applies to you and the people that you know. And in general, because they are so good at the more symbolic, subconscious way of processing, they may sometimes struggle with the kind of logical, linear, objective, more masculine function that Mercury typically loves. And so this can feel sometimes like a challenge. However, it's obviously a gift in its own right in a different way. Venus retrograde. This is one of the hardest ones that I have personally seen. There generally is a larger transformation that the soul desires when this planet is retrograde. There are, of course, lots of gifts to Venus retrograde, but in terms of like practical everyday ways of seeing this play out in people's lives, I definitely have noticed that they will tend to have more disappointments in their love life. I have definitely seen, if looking at this last point here, that they will kind of put people on a pedestal and idealize partners. And then the reality sets in that that person is not what you think they are. They are human. And you kind of feel like you are let down. Or you might go after partners who are elusive, who are not available to you. So there's often this difficulty with, grounding reality into what Venus wants, which is a beautiful, blissful, kind of almost etheric relationship. And so that is typically where some of the issues arrive. It's around perception and being able to really see people and their behavior clearly. However, they are also really great at having a more autonomous and independent set of internal values. So they kind of feel more easily into their own intuition. This is right and this is wrong. But because they are so kind of passive and harmonious and non-aggressive by nature, they might have more trouble if the family is very pushy. Like if the family is like, this is how to think, this is what, you should view the world as, this is what you should value. And so they might give in to that instead of listening to their own strong inner compass. So if you know someone with a Venus retrograde, always encourage them to follow their own personal judgment for what's right and wrong, even if it's different than those around them. In general, men with a Venus retrograde are going to be closer to the feminine within themselves, their own instincts, sometimes the mother or even female friends. And then the women are often more connected to their masculine. Mars retrograde. So Mars is the warrior, the hero, our drive, our sexuality, our anger. And so when it's retrograde, this part of us can be suppressed during childhood. And this can often come because there may be a more kind of dominant masculine figure in our lives, oftentimes the father, that just takes up so much space that it makes it feel like our inner warrior cannot fully express itself. And so this can often result in a harder time accessing your individuality, because Mars is a planet associated with separation and autonomy that happens at the pivotal age of 2. And so if you are kind of taught that you're not allowed to separate from the parents, you're not allowed to be your own unique self, you have a harder time owning what makes you different and being confident and loving that about yourself. And so you will try to look for that kind of confidence through validation from others. And this can often be kind of turning to the Father for praise and acknowledgement, or maybe even trying to find that somewhere else outside of yourself. Usually when a planet is retrograde, it can be projected onto other people. So instead of you being the masculine one, you having all these desires, you being your own hero, your own warrior, this kind of, sexual being that is very potent or powerful. Instead of you being that, you see that in other people. You can find people outside of you who embody these qualities, but you really do. It's just that you might not own it as easily. Sometimes it can also feel like people outside of you are the ones thwarting you, the ones trying to stop you. And of course, that's not the case, but it's a projection of what's happening inside. They can often be revolutionaries who are compelled to speak up on others' behalf, especially around things like oppression or inequality. And this is kind of where their Mars is almost transmuted in some way. It's like, I'm so angry that I'm pushing this down within myself, but because this is a safe area to let it out, I will protect other people and I will let it come out in that way. One of the best ways to use a Mars retrograde is to push yourself to be the best version of yourself. So kind of using that drive within yourself to continue to improve. If you're not experiencing your anger in an open way, then it can come out sideways through passive aggressiveness, controlling people, manipulating people, anything that is not a direct form of expression. People with Mars retrograde also often really work well on their own. Mars is an entrepreneurial planet. It has an independent spirit. So people with Mars retrograde also have this independent spirit, and they need to feel really connected to the meaning of what they're pursuing. Why am I taking action on this? What is the bigger purpose? And so if they're just working as a cog in a machine, I don't think that's going to go well for their spirit. And sometimes they will also have an inner contradiction where they really want to express this part of themselves. They really want to find and strive for that meaning, but they also may kind of lack the drive to put those desires out into the world, externalize it, put it into action. And so they need to almost have their passion like pushed out of them. There sometimes needs to be an external stimulus that kind of ignites that to finally emerge from within them. And again, this is because if their hero, their inner warrior, is suppressed, then they might have trouble believing that they deserve to act on these things, that they have it in them, even though those desires are there. Jupiter retrograde is the least challenging to have in the natal chart. It can also have pretty diverse sets of expressions. But what I have seen in particular is that those with Jupiter retrograde often come from a very different kind of family background. So what I mean by that is they tend to be a lot different than their parents. And this could mean that there's like a variation in social or religious backgrounds, that this could be a very important part of their life. Like their parents were very Christian and they grew up to do astrology, for example. Or they could have grown up in a really forward-thinking, justice-oriented household. They could have had a more education-based household, a household really focused on adventure or travel or even social status. There could be some type of restlessness in their childhood home. But generally what I see is that there's a need for them to depart from where they grew up, to leave the nest, abandon their origin, and find people who reflect their authentic beliefs and desires and kind of morals. And I've seen this with people who did grow up in a religious household or did grow up in a really rich household, and they have very different sets of values and beliefs about life that they are trying to go bring out into the world that does not really fit with their family. Their family might even feel limiting in some ways. I've also seen that people can be prone to overconfidence and hubris, an inflated sense of self, so they can have trouble with the larger perspective of how they fit into this larger sense of the world, and they can feel like they have maybe more power and influence than they actually do. However, Jupiter retrograde tends to bring out a lot of inspiration in the people around them. So they can really bring people to see the world through new eyes, to discover faraway lands, to discover more about themselves. And they can oftentimes be viewed as like a guru, where people tend to kind of project upon them that they are this spiritual being that knows so much more than they do. Or sometimes they might even look for a guru themselves. Lastly, they might feel guilty or shameful for the sins of their people. Even though it's not theirs, they almost have this kind of angelic quality of wanting to do what's best and feel like they're somehow responsible for things of the past that they didn't even actually do to other people. Saturn retrograde in the natal chart can leave people feeling like they have some type of imbalance in terms of their personal sense of worthiness. So this can give you anxiety and make you feel like you are not enough, like you aren't going to be accepted and loved for who you are, like you don't really have enough to offer, or like you don't believe in what you have to offer and in yourself. And this can often really result in a struggle with boundaries. This can come up in relationships, especially you'll see this with other people, and it will really be focused in this house where Saturn is. So let's say you have Saturn in the 6th house, your work relationships, people, if it's retrograde here, people might give you a lot more work than they give to other people. They're like, oh, Sally will do that. She always says yes. And so there is this kind of lack of boundaries that people sense within you and will push back on that. And this is oftentimes linked to having a physically or emotionally absent father. That's not always the case, but often the father kind of represents this container, the boundaries within ourselves in a more kind of external sense. And so when the father is not there, it can be internalized as not having that container. And that can lead to a lot of fear, not feeling contained, like existential fear of kind of disappearing, of losing control, of being vulnerable. And so sometimes these individuals will react by trying to hold on to what is known. They will maybe hold on to like a dogma or a belief or their way of doing things, because there is that deeper fear that if I release control, if I let things in, then I could be taken over, something bad could happen. And it's almost like there is this fear that the new things can disrupt that fragile foundation of who they are. And this is often a deeply subconscious thing. It's not like, oh, I have this existential fear. No, this is happening really underneath the surface. And sometimes it's this mask of control that is masking a false sense of inner peace or inner balance, where they have everything together when in reality they really don't. And they can sometimes also oscillate between this feeling of being really capable and then being really impotent. So like, oh, this bad thing happens in my life and I overcome it and I'm amazing. And then this other bad thing happens and I'm like, I feel just so powerless. And so they might not have a strong foundation of themselves and their sense of worthiness. And so it can really oscillate in terms of their experience of life's challenges. And this comes in really clearly with imposter syndrome, for example. And they will often maybe work harder or do more for people, say yes more, because there's this feeling of inadequacy, or again, compensating for fear of vulnerability or criticism or not being accepted and loved. So they can really take on too much responsibility for other people, and they have often a hard time really recognizing this is mine, that is theirs. And so their boundaries are often crossed. Lastly, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto retrograde. So again, these are really not significant to have retrograde in the natal chart because it is so common to have them retrograde. They don't have a super noticeable experience. This is just very common for lots of people. And so I'm just going to kind of briefly talk about it. It's honestly even hard to truly tell how exactly we experience these planets retrograde, to be totally honest. But this is what astrologers think. So Uranus retrograde is almost like this collective experience to find alternative ways of thinking. This is like the Einsteins of the group who are finding kind of new innovative thoughts, translating this information for people, but also still remaining connected to the world around them. So how can I go off into these really foreign lands and explore these dimensions while also bringing that information back or feeling, again, connected to people around me? And without this personal exploration, they might feel more anxiety or irritability because it's almost like this important, unique expression themselves doesn't have an outlet. Neptune retrograde can result in having maybe more issues around self-perception. So, for example, if you don't have a strong sense of identity, you might over-identify with what your family thinks you should be like or what your family is saying that you are. You might just kind of take what they say, like, oh, you're a funny person. You might be like, yeah, I'm a funny person. That's an easy one because it's positive. But if it's negative, this could impact you in a difficult way. And so they might just be more open to other people's perceptions of them. But for so many of us, we do have Uranus and Neptune conjunct. And so that's going to create a little bit of a different scenario because Uranus is a truth seeker. So it's going to make Neptune much less prone to kind of lies. But I will say Neptune retrograde, I've also heard that creates somebody who has difficulty with their sensitivity. So it's like, okay, I am a sensitive person, but how do I assimilate that in this harsh world? And kind of having to deal with that fact where maybe Neptune direct individuals have learned more about emotional regulation, how to take the good with the bad and not get overwhelmed by it. So I've also heard Uranus retrograde people sometimes have a little bit of disowning around their individuality. I don't necessarily always find that to be true, but sometimes that's the case. And then lastly, Pluto retrograde, they might be just more connected to kind of generational angst or certain kind of deeper emotional traumas and insights that their Pluto generation experiences. So they're more maybe reflective of it, or they could go in the opposite way and just completely disown it. But they're generally going to be maybe more impacted by it or connected to it, whether they're willing to look at it or not. Pluto retrograde might be intuitive in their own unique ways as well. And Pluto is associated with our souls across many lifetimes. So there may be something kind of around that, but I'll let you guys explore. Again, these planets in terms of retrograde are not super well understood, not super obvious, whereas other planets of course are. So this will be really fun for you guys to kind of look at in your chart and the charts of your friends, to experiment, take that power in your own hands to see how this plays out. And I hope that you guys enjoyed this. Thanks.